Okay, so as David said, I'm Ron Herman. I'm in the Department of Physics, Astronomy, and Geosciences, where I am a professor of science education. So my background, the first 11 years of my career was teaching high school science. And then since about around 2007, I've been here at Towson University. And I work primarily with pre-service science teachers. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today really comes out of my work working with those pre-service science teachers here at Towson University. So sort of the two main things that I wanted to talk about today was the way that we use grades as a system of measurement and some inherent flaws in doing so, and a potential way to alleviate those flaws by implementing standards-based grading. And I think it makes even more sense now in this sort of era that we're in of online instruction due to the COVID pandemic. And as David said, if you have any questions, feel free to just interrupt me or throw them in the chat, and I'll get to those. So I wanted just to ask those of you that would like to share, I know that the shift to online instruction has changed a lot of things for myself personally. And one of the things that I know a lot of people have been thinking about and worrying about one, the amount of time it takes to do things, which I think we can all agree is a little bit more, but also the kinds of tasks that I've been assigning to students, how I go about grading those tasks and providing feedback for those tasks. And I guess the bigger issue I hear a lot of is the last thing that I have on the screen, academic integrity issues around whether students are plagiarizing. So does anyone want to sort of share what they've been doing or how they've shifted instruction and assigning tasks and scoring those tasks, or have any questions about the complications of that? Oh, hey, Felicia. It's nice to see some friendly faces in the chat. Well, all right. Well, no one wants to join.
There is a post on the chat.
Oh, let me see. I must have the wrong screen up because I don't see the chat. I
can read it out loud. I've allowed. This is from Carrie. I have allowed students to use their books for exams.
Oh, books for exams. So open book exams. David, I'm not sure why I can't see my chat.
Yeah, I'll offer something. Similarly, I guess in the course I teach and sort of help coordinate, we didn't want to worry about students using notes or books or even resources. So we just gave them a big warning that while those things are not prohibited, they are likely to be unsuccessful. Or they're likely to prove helpful during exams. And we just try to make our exams so that using things like that is not, helpful. I mean, we tell students they should study and take notes and have, a distilled set of notes in front of them during the exam, but to think that they can sort of learn on the fly or look up answers during the test is just not going to help. So the only thing we sort of strictly forbid is communication with other students.
And how do you, how do you think you prevent that from happening?
How do we prevent communication from happening?
Yeah, I think that's the concern that I've heard people have.
So we watch them. They have to sign in through their phone to a Zoom meeting where we monitor them. So they have to set up their phone so that we can see their workspace and their face. We have not said they had to aim it at their screen, but I'm starting that now. We just had the first exam. We don't really know that there were any problems this time, but I had another case of academic integrity violation, communication, but not simultaneous. All right, so one thing is, for this large class, we made it so that everybody in the class has to take the test at the same time. So we got the registrar's office to allow us to give a common exam time for all sections. So this is 700 students taking it at the same time. The test, we constructed it so that it's randomized. So it just would be too hard for them to help each other because they don't have the same questions. They don't have the same question order.
So you have a really large like test bank of questions.
Well, it probably took 2 of us, and I'm not exaggerating, probably 80 hours to construct this test together, 80 woman hours in this case. And we created a bank. There's certainly 2 people can have the same question. They won't have the same test because of the randomization, but they'll have some similar questions, but then they're in a different order.
Yeah.
We do allow, they only can see 1 question at a time. We do allow them to go back though, because we think that would be inhumane if they can't skip a question and come back. But we just know that we're minimizing the effect, even if they try, they may be trying to cheat a little bit. It's not going to help a student who doesn't know anything. They're not going to pass. We're pretty confident they couldn't cheat their way to passing. So yeah, well, I don't want to say it makes sense because you just put in 80 hours to make an exam, but it makes sense for the number of students that you're serving, 700, students. So I guess there's a cost benefit, there to the number of students that you're serving versus the time that you're putting in. Right. Yeah, I mean, we'll get faster. I mean, some of that time was sort of initial outlay that will help us construct future tests because now we have sort of versions of questions that will be easier. Some of it is just creating the test in a format that we can do on Blackboard.
Yes.
That's what's so time consuming.
It is.
So, yeah.
Yeah, been there, done that. It's very time consuming to put the questions into Blackboard, but there's on the back end, I think it pays off once you get everything loaded.
That's right. Yeah, grading them is actually easier than normal. Yeah.
So there are multiple choice questions.
A whole variety of. There's some short answer. There's some multiple choice. There's fill in the blanks. There's all different kinds of formats. Yeah. The short answer. I mean, you kind of need some short answer to check to double check on that cheating because that's how I caught these other 2 girls who cheated because it was a quiz and one just said she couldn't take the quiz with the class because she had some excuse. And sure enough, she got the full set of notes from her friend who had taken it, 7 hours earlier. And she just straight up copied from her friend's work. And it was very obvious because it was wrong answers. Felt terrible. I mean, these are nice. They're very sweet girls and who did a stupid thing. And yeah, so. Oh, and that was very strange because there were 5 open-ended questions that had 3 different versions. They happened to get the same questions for all 5. Like I mean, I know mathematically that is highly unlikely, not impossible, but it's really weird that they got the same combination of questions. But
all right, well, thanks,
Ron. I believe that there's that Melanie had her hand raised.
Yes, I'll just jump in. That's really interesting. There are times where you definitely have to have objective questions, and I'm working with a publisher for one of my classes where the publisher has that enormous test bank, and so we were able to create similar type of thing. We don't do the proctoring part, but we just have like 800 questions in a pool, 75 questions for the test. And they were able to look at like Bloom's taxonomy and like vary the level of the questions. We tell them how many in each chapter and how many in each level we want, and it can pull from those. And I found when it came to the grades, it really seemed quite fair. There weren't a large number of A's. There were quite a few students who, a few, just a handful of F's and D's, but a lot of C's and B's and A's. So I think hopefully in that case that served its purpose. One of the things that I've noticed though that I think has changed a lot is discussions, because you can't have the same type of discussions in online as you would in a classroom. And I found that it takes students multiple weeks to warm up to your class before they're willing to even turn their cameras on. Like I let them have that choice in the beginning, but as we keep going, I'm like, come on, everybody, let's let's do our best to show ourselves. And they get a little talking a little bit better, but I've tried to just find the technology that can serve the purpose. So, you know, there's Padlet, which allows for a discussion board where all students can see each entry that the other students have put on there. I also use Flipgrid, which is little 3-minute videos where they can post something, and then I assign them groups and they all have to go in and watch the little videos and then make a little video response to it. And so the discussions are not as organic for sure, and they take place over several days. But that's one thing that I've really tried to find ways to replicate, is the really good, what we learn from discussion of content.
Yeah, it certainly is taking on a different flavor in the online environment. And some of my students are still not warmed up to turning on their cameras. Any other thoughts anyone wants to share before I move forward?
I was really kind of a stickler about the camera, and I told them it was not an option. That if they had a good reason why they couldn't turn on their camera, they had to email me and give me that good reason. You know, and I understand sometimes. So like I bugged them. You know, you can press the ping, like turn on your camera. So you know, it shows up to them as sort of a chat. You know, and occasionally they'll tell me, like, I'm in my car right now, I'm on my way, and if they're participating and they don't have their camera on, I lay off more. Like if they're chiming in, it's hard though, because someone starts talking, you don't know who's talking because you don't know
correct
face moving. You know, they realize how awkward it is. They totally know that. My students who, you know, do show their cameras, they say that in classes where most students don't turn on their cameras, it's just a bummer. Like they have the same feeling the teacher has. Like they're just looking at these gray walls, and then they're embarrassed to turn on their camera if most people are not. Which is why I want it to not, I just want the norm to be your camera is on, you know, but, you know, if they're not, and some of them are lying down in bed, they're under their covers while you're doing it, but if they're participating, I don't care. I get on them if they're not showing their face and you don't even know if they're there because they're not saying a word. And a lot of times when the class ends, by the way, have you noticed those people are still there?
Yes.
Because they don't even know classes ended. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, I tell them, I'm like, I know what it means when you're, you know, most of the time it means you're doing something else. You might have walked away. But if they are participating, even if they're lying in their bed, but they're clearly engaged, I lay off. I don't care. But if they're just lying there like a lump or they have their camera off and not participating, you know, that's just not okay. And then I'm like, would you go into a classroom and just climb up on the desk if you're feeling sleepy and close your eyes and put your head down? Like, what the heck?
Yeah. Well, at the same time, I think some of us that have been to lots of meetings realize the benefits of sometimes turning your camera off. So I hate to be too hypocritical of the students on that account. Okay, so anyhow, obviously lots has changed, but I think, you know, I'm always trying to look for the sort of positives of this switch to online. And one of the things that we were discussing in my science methods class is that, you know, for K through 12 students, we think the snow day phenomenon is probably over, and instead of snow days, students will move to online instruction on those days. And so, you know, I don't think we're going to be done with online instruction after this pandemic. And I think there's some things that we can learn from it, maybe some things that are, you know, actually beneficial that will come out of this when we do get out of it, and we will get out of it, but, you know, it might take a little while. So, you know, so some of the shifts that I think I've been trying to make, I think are beneficial because they'll be helpful after the pandemic when we're back to face-to-face instruction. I can still use those. So, you know, one of the shifts that I've been trying to make is, and sort of, I don't want to use the term preach, but preach to my pre-service teachers, is just about the way that we grade things and, you know, why we grade things and what the grades mean, and that bigger picture of sort of why we're doing this, you know, this teaching thing to begin with, and, you know, what it should look like and what the purpose should be. And for me, the challenge has always been, anytime I'm, you know, working with students or trying to explain something, it's probably the same challenge that you've noted. We are trying to teach somebody how to do something, and we're sort of coaching them to be better at that thing. And then at some point we have to evaluate them to see if they can actually do it themselves. And that's, you know, at some point we just have to do that evaluation piece and assign a grade. But our goal should be focusing on students being able to do something, produce something, or, whatever the objective of your course is. So it's kind of focused me on looking at the bigger picture things that are really important. And I've been really trying to work with this on my students of, these bigger questions rather than, someone mentioned Bloom's taxonomy, rather than kind of going to that, rote memorization kind of level that is so easy to write questions about, but really to get to the enduring understanding. So my students now are working on lessons, and they're trying to help students understand photosynthesis by asking a question about how a seed becomes a tree. Where does that mass come from? It's big enduring understanding that people can take away and explain to other people how a tree grows, or what happens to the mass of a log when you put it in a fire and it becomes ash. Is it conserved, or does it change into something else? And so these enduring understandings that McTighe and Wiggins have been talking about for years now, I think it's really focused me on moving away from answering or asking these kind of rote memorization knowledge questions. So that's been a good thing for me to sort of focus a little bit more on that. And I've really been trying to, help my students and really refine my thinking about what grades are. And so, would anyone care to share their definition of what a grade is? Because it's one of those things that we all know what it is, but when you try to articulate it, sometimes we have different ideas of what grades are. If you were my students, I would just call on somebody, but I don't necessarily want to do that.
I'll respond, Ron. I think maybe
Thanks for playing along.
It's proof that you've acquired the knowledge.
Okay, so proof that you've acquired the knowledge. All right, I like that.
It's a way to quantify how much someone learned. That's what the goal is. You're trying to quantify on a scale of 0 to 100.
How much someone learned.
How much someone learned.
Yeah. So where's the one from, which is 1 from 100, 0 to 100?
Yeah.
So where's that come from?
Oh, where does this, well, it doesn't matter. It could be 0 to 10. What do you mean?
You said 0 to 100. I was just wondering if you were talking about
out of
percent or
100%.
points.
No, it's any scale, whatever the scale, numerical scale is.
Okay.
I mean, maybe a better question would be like, so then why is the top 10% an A, the next 10% a B? Maybe that's what you're asking.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the question, right? And so it's a good kind of thought thing that we've always had this system where we have sort of these 10% increments, where, there are other areas of life where, 50% is considered really good, right? If you're trying to hit a baseball, that's really good. Or if you're trying to shoot 3-pointers, maybe that's really good. But we've got this kind of system where we've just kind of never really questioned it, and it's always been there, these 10% increments.
Right. That's a better question. Why is, I mean, we've somehow equated A to, an A range, 90% to 100 as sort of outstanding. That's meant to be kind of, you've reached, what high quality stuff. And then the next range, a B range is like, you've hit the mark well, it's good.
Mm-hmm.
And then fair, I don't know, that's the stuff that I think is more malleable. Like maybe maybe we're too harsh, too lenient, I don't know. But then it's also totally subjective anyway. Like I struggle with that, when we're looking at instructors who, I get nervous when I see someone, teaching a class and they end up with, 65 to 70% of their students are getting A's. And I question, like, what are the expectations there,
Yep. So a lot of good questions. The thing about percentages, right? So, if we think of those as like buckets, where we've got the A bucket, the B bucket. Let's see, the failure bucket is the biggest one, right? It's the easiest one for someone to hit because it's 0 to 60, and so there's not, in terms of our assigning a letter grade to that, there's no difference between a 0 and a 59. Right? It's going to show up on somebody's transcript as a failing grade. So, you know, I think there's a lot of inherent issues with grading to begin with. And that's one of the things I noticed. So one of the tasks I give my pre-service teachers, I'll just share real briefly with you. I give them a 7-item multiple choice quiz for a middle school class. And if I can pull this up here, I don't know if I can, how easy I can do that. Can you see that Word document? Okay. So it's just a simple 7-point kind of quiz. For those of you that haven't had bio in a while, it's your genetics and your Punnett squares that you learned about, kind of simple stuff there. And so I just asked them the question that was on the screen there. What would you put in your grade book if the student had all the questions correct except for number 4 on there? And this semester, I had 17 students in my class, and I asked them that question. And here's what they said. So some would give them a 7 out of 8, others an 8 out of 10. Some would put a 6 out of 7 in the grade book. One person did a 5 out of 5, and so on and so forth. So asking 17 instructors what they would put in their grade book, how you would grade it, I got 9 different unique ways of doing that. And Felice was kind of touching on this, you know, subjective kind of nature of it. It's completely arbitrary almost how we go ahead and assign grades or a value of something. We just kind of do it, and students largely don't question it. Why is this worth 10 points? Why is this worth 12 points? These aren't questions that they ask. They just do the thing, and if it's worth 12 points, they want 12 points. So they don't necessarily arrive. And if they did, most of our explanations, I think, are a little ad hoc. Question 4 was worth 2 points because it involves a little bit more, and so we kind of assign point values to individual questions. And even if it's 7 questions, we might say they're worth, 3 of them are worth 1 point, the other 4 are worth 2 points. We're just kind of making that up as we go along, and no one really challenged us on that. They just kind of go along with it. So the importance for me is what that means, right? That student, depending if we had those 9 different ways of doing it, the same student, depending on who they have as the instructor, can get anywhere between an 80% and 100% on that task, on that quiz. Right? And so that's a little disconcerting for me that there's this wide range there. But as you know, as an instructor, the thing that we do is once it's in the grade book, it's like a data point that we have accurately measured. But we didn't. We just kind of arbitrarily picked some number out of the blue, and there it is. Felice?
Okay, but for your students, it might have been a little more arbitrary because they're not experts sort of in teaching and learning of that content, and they don't necessarily know what's important or not. But I hope that we are doing it more thoughtfully. And when we assign, if we have some questions and some of them we call, that's going to be 1 point, that's going to be called 2 points, we're doing that for a good reason. We believe the 2-pointer is maybe more conceptually difficult. Maybe it's, there's a reason why we're making it worth twice as much as another.
I agree.
Okay, so it's not so terribly arbitrary. What?
Well, it's arbitrary in the sense that if you and I didn't talk and we gave the same assignment and I was teaching a different section, we might assign different values to it.
Yeah, that's true. Well, yeah, that's why it's talk to your colleagues and.
Yeah. So, hopefully there's consistency across sections. I know we have like group coordinators that do that for certain classes and class coordinators, and try to work those things out. But that's not always the case, I don't think. And even then, it's just, I would say it's arbitrary by committee, maybe. This is a 2-point question, this is a 1-point question. So yeah, maybe it's less of an extent here at the university, but to me, it's still a little bit arbitrary. So this has long been noted, and it's something that has always sort of not sat very well with me. Going all the way back to what I found was Thorndike in 1904 talking about this in terms of these vocabulary terms, and some of them are clearly easier for students to spell. Obviously, these wouldn't necessarily be on the same, you remember back to elementary school and having to take vocabulary tests, probably not all on the same test. But let's say earlier in the year, we have some words like ant and vet, and we have to decide whether those are 1-point words or 2-point words, or do we go by syllables, or how do we assign how difficult it is to spell these words. And then later in the year, we get to maybe some more difficult questions. Is juxtaposition, is that still a 1-point term later in the year, or is it now a 2-point or a 3-point term if we can spell it correctly? So this has always been a little bit of an issue in terms of how we measure and assign point values to things. And so what I've been thinking more and more of more recently is that we're not dealing with a system of measurement, because a system of measurement really is defined here as repeating system. So for example, if you look at temperature, the difference between 99 degrees and 100 degrees is 1 degree Fahrenheit. It means the same at that point of the scale as it does between 0 and 1 degree, right? But that is not the same with a point value system, as we just saw from the previous slide. And I've got it again here just to illustrate that if we're talking about a 9 out of 10, and this, to come back to Felice's point, is something that my students bring up when they were assigning these values. Well, if I assign more points to it and students miss a point, then it doesn't take as much off their grade, right? If I had 7 questions and each one is worth a point and they miss one, it's 1/7, as opposed to, if I did something else, it might be a little bit different. So, that's what I'm saying here, is that it's not a system of measurement, but we treat it as it is a system of measurement. Once we put these numbers in our grade book, we act like we have very accurately and reliably measured them. And I just don't think that that's the case. I'm not saying that we don't do that. I'm guilty of it. I think everybody that has a grade book has done something in that way, because we don't have a better system for assessing students. So, I like to think of grades as, because of that it's not an accurate system, as, there's a little bit of an error inherent in it. And this you may note more if you're a parent with your own children, when you go in to talk to their teacher about the grade in the grade book, and, this 78.9, what does that mean? And you find out as a parent and as a previous high school teacher, we do lots of crazy stuff, less so at the university, but a lot in K through 12, right? So we're supposed to be measuring understanding of genetics, but the grade is a reflection of whether somebody can turn something in on time or not, or whether they were absent, or losing 10 points for turning it in 2 days late, or whatever it is. So I think there's this plus or minus error in there, but I know a lot of teachers, a lot of instructors say, well, my grade book says it's a 79.83, and that's it. I can't bump it up. That's what it is. Right? But it's kind of based on a foundation that's not really accurate. So, I think there's something we can do around that. And obviously the title of my talk is, standards-based grading. So really, to understand that and why I think there's value in it, I have to, we kind of have to ask ourselves why we teach. And it goes back to what I said earlier about wanting students to learn, right? We should be doing this so that students learn something, not simply to assign a grade. At some point, we do need to assign a grade for a variety of reasons. No one's disputing that. But we also want students to learn something. And so this time of year, very aptly, I like to use the analogy of, like, if you wanted to grow the largest pumpkin, right, what would you do? And, it's a question I ask my students, and they're science folks, so they give me a range of things: get good seeds and lots of water and sunlight and, nutrients and all that stuff. And that's very true. And that's what I want them to say, because you want to take care of the pumpkin. You want it to grow. You want to give it the nourishment and the nutrients that it needs to grow. And the same is true of our students. We need to sort of feed them, and we're feeding them with that knowledge base, right? What we don't need to do is weigh them every single day. Like, if you're trying to grow the largest pumpkin, you don't need to weigh it every day to see if it's growing, right? What you need to do is focus on it getting the nutrients. So we have a tendency to sort of over-test sometimes, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. We over-assess students, and that really just also takes away from instructional time, when we could be, feeding them and providing them with more nourishment. So I was kind of struggling with this a few years ago, and also at the same time talking to one of my former students, Paul Lee, who graduated in 2011 from Towson with a physics education degree. So we were talking about this, and I just happened to see one of his posts on social media that he had been moving to standards-based grading. And I was thinking about it at the same time here at Towson, standards-based grading. So I said, Paul, the Maryland Association for Science Teacher Conference is coming up. Do you want to do a presentation on standards-based grading? And he said, yes. So I said, great. And I came up with the title, and I said, Paul, my titles are not very creative or unique. You know, you want to take a stab at it. And if you can see the screen, you'll see what he came up with. Standards-based grading, retiring educational hungry hippos. He sent that to me in email. I looked at it and I said, Paul, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he said, you know, hungry hippos. Students just want to gobble up points like the hippos gobble up those little balls. That's all they want. How can I get more points? How can I get more points? Like, they don't care about what they learn. They just want to get the points. They come to you and say, I need to get an A in your class, not I need to really understand genetics. So he had this sort of frustration that moved him to standards-based grading. And so we did this talk together. And I've been trying to implement it, you know, where it fits in my class. So if you're not familiar with standard-based grading, it is what it sounds like. You come up with a standard. That's the standard that you want students to reach. Felice mentioned earlier, you know, this worry about more people getting A's than maybe they should. And so what standards basically does, right, is say, here's the standard. If you reach the standard and, you know, you can perform that standard, do that thing, explain it, then you have sort of that higher grade, right? So there's nothing inherently preventing everybody in the class from getting an A if they understand that standard. We know that's not always going to be the case, and we're going to have students that can't meet that for a variety of reasons. But the goal is that everybody has the potential to reach that highest level of understanding. So the focus is more so on students demonstrating their understanding than just trying to get points for the sake of getting points. And this is probably more true, especially of our non-majors, right, that don't necessarily take your class so they can have that knowledge with them for their career or for grad school or whatever it happens to be. If they're in your major, then they have this, you know, this greater need to really understand things. But for a lot of our non-majors, they're just sort of trying to get through a class and get the best grade they can on their transcript to do that. So moving to standards-based grading has really changed the discussion from, you know, what can I do to get more points, to how can I demonstrate to you that I really do understand this. And so standards-based grading can take on a couple of different scoring dynamics, but usually it looks something a little bit like this. I realize it's a little bit hard to see maybe on my screen, but I'm sure we'll post this after this presentation. So there's like, in this way of doing it, I've got 4 categories, but on the next slide, I've got the way that Paul does it. And I do it in my class. So it's 0 here, right? So oftentimes if you look at a 0 in the gradebook, you'd be hard pressed if you went back to like the beginning of the semester to know, you know, if that 0 meant a student didn't turn something in, or if they actually turned it in and got a 0 on it, right? So we use a 0 sometimes to mean both of those things. So here a 0 basically just means it was not turned in, and a 1 is the lowest level, doesn't meet the standard. 2 is telling students that they're approaching what you want them to be able to do or to know. 3 is basically, you know, in this scenario, you met the standard. And then 4 is you're beyond, you've exceeded the standard, right? So this is another kind of way of doing it: full mastery, mastery, partial mastery, a little bit of mastery, or no mastery. And so what this does for me is if I take that task that had 7 items, I don't have to worry whether it's 7 points or 10 points, it's 4. 4 is what you get, and a 4 doesn't mean 4 out of 4. It's giving feedback to the students that you really got this down, you've met this standard. When I look at that 4 in my grade book, I know what that means, all right? A 3 doesn't mean you missed 1 item or 2 items. It means that you're at that standard, but maybe don't have the most sophisticated understanding of it. But, you know, you're there and you're good enough to go, and, you know, you're probably going to be just fine there. Where a 2 is giving feedback to the students, and I'm not marking up their papers, I'm just telling them it's a 2, right? And so because they have to know they haven't met the standard, and then they're going to say, well, what can I do to show that I have, right? Rather than me just sort of marking something out and saying, no, the answer was not, you know, A, it's B. And then, you know, haven't really learned anything, they say, oh, okay, that's nice, now I know that. So students are able to sort of resubmit things, or really, in a lot of cases, do it in a different way, and I'll give you an example of that. I just put this in because I know it's going to go up on the facet pages and stuff. So some links if you're interested in learning more, and some good videos on standard-based grading at that link. So some of this is Paul's language, because he's been doing this with his students for a lot longer than I have. But the students are sort of always working towards that standard rather than just doing things for points. And so, you know, the focus is really on giving students the opportunity to revise things and turn them in differently. And I think one of the ways that Paul's doing it is what I really like, especially in this online environment. And I have a slide in here that has one of his students, but the video no longer works. I don't know what I did to it. But the girl's basically at home. You know, you can see she's almost in her pajamas in front of a whiteboard, and she's doing a physics problem on the whiteboard that you'd hang in your kitchen or something to write notes on for your family. And she's working out the problem and recording it on her phone to send, to say, look, I'm trying to demonstrate to you that I really do understand this and I can solve this problem, you know, here, even though I got the other one incorrect, right? So not trying to revisit that same problem, but showing it on a new problem. So one of the things that I've noticed when I allow students to sort of revise and resubmit, that we're all familiar with from our publishing, that revise and resubmit, sometimes people don't pay attention to the fact that they can actually do that. They kind of are, okay, I got the feedback, it's a 2, I don't really understand it, but okay, I'm just gonna move on. So I've got to tell them, remember, you can resubmit this, right? You want to get your understanding up on this concept and really be able to understand it. And it's kind of helped me focus on what is the standard? Like, what do I really want students to know? Right? It's not this shotgun approach where I'm going to teach a bunch of stuff and then afterwards say, well, what did I want them to know when I taught all that stuff? I'm really trying to be more deliberate now and saying, this is what I want you to be able to do. And that's the standard. And I'm only going to measure that. And then the thing that Paul does that I think is nice, I haven't quite brought myself to do it, is like any time during the semester to go back and revisit something from week 1. He'll throw a standard out there, a question from week 1 if he's in week 10. And if a student falls below standards, then he'll move their score down on that, right? And it tells them, oh, this is still important, even though we're 10 weeks later in the course. It's still important, you still need to know that. So you got to go back and work on that standard, right? It's not this teach, test, hope for the best kind of thing that happens where we teach something, we test it, and then we move on. He's kind of always forcing the students to go back and revisit stuff that they've done earlier. So we mentioned Bloom's taxonomy. I see Felice has a question.
Yeah, can you say, like, what do you give students to do to revisit? What is the suggested way for them to revisit something?
Yeah, so so what I try not to do is just have them revise the assignment. Like here it is back, you know, it was a 2, and then I don't want them just to fix that. So I may say if it is, you know, if we're doing, let's go back to my genetics problem. If we're doing a series of Punnett squares, you know, rather than have them solve another Punnett square, I might have them answer, you know, describe to me what a Punnett square is and what would happen, more of a word problem. What would happen if, you know, the father had a, you know, heterozygous and the mother was, you know, so it's a different question.
So you provide, okay, so actually I wasn't asking what do you do to reassess them? And it sounds like you're talking about you have to give them a new task. So that sounds complicated for the teacher, but my question was actually, what do you expect them to do to relearn it before they're even reassessed? Like, you know, you tell them you haven't quite mastered this, you can revise and like, you need to learn this more, or whatever. What do they have? What materials, resources do they have to try to learn it better?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. It's the same stuff that I guess is always there, making use of me, you know, rather than like, oh, I got a poor score on this, I'm done with it, I can't do anything with it. And, you know, long story short, I think it's a sad story, but I didn't become, obviously we're here, we do some publishing. I didn't become a good writer really until I was working on my doctorate, not as an undergrad, certainly not as a high school student, not when I was working on my master's. It wasn't until my doctorate where my professor, forced us to resubmit, to keep working on it, keep working on it, keep working on it. And I just think, I understand why, time-wise, we do need to move on at some point. But unless we provide these opportunities to revise and resubmit, as I said, so students, I think, understand that more so with standard-based grading, that it's worth it for me to do that, to revise and resubmit. So if you're going to mark somebody's paper up and just give it back to them and say that's the end of it, why would they even read your comments if they can't revise and resubmit? So I think the discussion changes a little bit to like, you made these comments on my paper, can we talk about them? What do they mean? How can I be better at this?
So that's interesting. Like in more, I think, like, I don't know if I have this, my course is certainly not set up the way you're describing with this mastery stuff, but I think that's my goal. And I think about, like, I just graded some assignment they had to turn in and I gave them tons of feedback. It's not that it's marked up, I just give them feedback, and I say, go compare your solutions to what is now posted as the solutions, like compare your responses. But you bring up a good point. What is the impetus for them to do that? I always say, I spend so much time grading your papers and giving you feedback. I hope you're reading it. And I think, why are they? Well, my hope is they're reading it because that was just an assignment. That was essentially a formative assessment, but hey, you're going to have an exam on these concepts. So that's why. And I guess that's the idea. They don't get to revise this particular task, but you need to learn the material better so that you can perform on the next thing that's going to have this stuff.
Yeah. And I think that brings up a whole other issue of the students that, and this is maybe more so where the grading differentiation comes in of who gets an A, a B, a C, and D. Is it because they understand it more, or because those students are more either internally or externally motivated to do that work, to get that grade? Some students might say, well, C is good enough. That was my high school career. C was good enough. I'm done with it. I'm moving on. I just didn't have that motivation at the time to do anything more than that. So, yeah, it's a good point. So, I've been trying to move up. I'm guilty as anyone on Bloom's taxonomy, asking some really low-level questions just because they're easy to write. You can write them quickly. A lot of the what Melanie was talking about, a lot of the textbook companies have written these questions, and I realized a lot of them were at that level too. And it's just easier to get more questions that are at that kind of lower level of Bloom's. So I've been working on fewer questions, but higher on Bloom's taxonomy. And so really they're more tasks, I would call them, than questions or those kinds of assessments. So I did want to share an example. So, and obviously this is not in everybody's wheelhouse. I know that you haven't been thinking about stratigraphic columns probably in the classes that you teach, or you'd be in my department. But, this is the kind of things I teach in my earth science class or my geology class that I teach. And students really have to interpret this. So there's a lot of vocabulary that goes into this, a lot of terminology. Basically a simple idea: if a layer is on the bottom, it's older than the layer on the top. And there's a principle for that. If something is crossing through another, like the E or the D that's cutting through, that's the law of cross-cutting relationships, or the principle of cross-cutting relationships. So it's easy to ask those kind of questions. But really, these side profile views, one of the things that we do in class is, we go over all that, and we ask students to order the events from the oldest to the youngest. And that's sort of what we're focused on, is really looking at these rocks and saying, what is the story? What is the geologic story of this area? What's the history of it? But here's some questions that I've actually used these questions on previous exams, when I can have students sit down with paper and pencil and circle either A, B, C, or D. Now, I don't really want to do that because, unlike, I just can't come up with 700 different questions that get at this to pull them out of a test bank, right? I've tried, and I've done some things to try to get at this summer when I was teaching geology online. But were they cheating? I don't know. But it was probably, you know, it was probably easier for them to do it if they wanted to cheat, because I just didn't have, I was treading water this summer trying to teach, coming up with questions. It took me long enough to put things in the test bank, yet alone come up with multiple versions. I just couldn't get there. So instead of asking these kind of more rote memorization kind of questions, what I do in my other class is really where I need to be shifting in this class. And this is the task. It's pretty much a blank sheet of paper, right? So what I'm asking, I know it's probably hard to read, I'm asking students to basically draw something that looks like this on their own. So every student is going to draw something different. They're going to include all those elements that I want. I even have the definitions. I'm sorry, went the wrong way. I have the terms at the top, superposition, cross-cutting relationships, all that. I'm telling them that. I'm not going to ask them that rote memorization. I'm using those words in the stem of the task. So now if I have 17 students, all 17 of these are going to look different. And then at the bottom, basically what I have them do is before they just kind of randomly put letters on the different layers, like you see here. And it's supposed to be solvable in one way, like it is here, right? But this tells me a lot. This really tells me whether they understand it, because sometimes what I see is this igneous intrusion that just kind of starting halfway up the rock column, which doesn't happen in nature, and it's something that we talk about that doesn't happen. I shouldn't see that. So looking at these, I can really get at whether they understand it. I can tell immediately when I look at these. And sometimes I have them, as it says at the bottom, they switch it with another student, and then the other student has to either try to solve it or say, look, there's something wrong here. You did something wrong, and give them feedback. So I've tried to move to these, you know, higher Bloom's taxonomy questions that get away from, you know, can you give me the definition of this term? So that means fewer questions. It means it's more difficult for students to cheat, and it's a little bit more cognitively, you know, demanding for the students to do. So this is really the last slide I have. It's not going to play. I already tried it. I think I've pulled it out in too many, but this is the girl I was talking about earlier, trying to demonstrate to Paul on the whiteboard that she understands it. So this isn't the question that Paul originally gave to the student. As you know, I said, it's a different question, but the student is walking through, you know, in their mind, how they go about solving this physics problem to demonstrate to Paul that she does understand it. And then Paul will either, you know, adjust the grade up or down, whether she met the standard. So I'll stop there and see if we have any other questions or comments about standards-based grading or anything else you want to talk about.
I'm going to hit stop record, Ron.